You can fake a badge, paint a logo on a truck, and even print official-looking paperwork, but you can't fake where a private road begins. The first thing I heard that Tuesday morning wasn't birdsong or the wind rolling across 600 acres of open pasture. It was the deep growl of oversized SUV tires crushing fresh limestone on the ranch road my grandfather carved out with a borrowed bulldozer in 1962. The smell of diesel drifted through the cool Texas air before the sun had fully cleared the oak trees, mixing with damp grass and cedar like something that didn't belong. I set my coffee mug on the porch rail and watched 3 white SUVs with oversized decals reading HOA Patrol drive straight through my front gate without slowing down. They weren't county deputies. They weren't state troopers. They weren't anyone with actual authority. They were security guards wearing matching uniforms, pretending confidence was the same thing as legal permission. The lead vehicle rolled past my weathered ranch sign, ignored every private property notice I'd installed, and continued across my land as though they owned every inch of it. I could hear cattle shifting nervously in the eastern pasture, the metallic clink of feed troughs echoing across the morning as dust rolled behind the convoy. That road wasn't a shortcut. It wasn't a public access lane. It wasn't part of the subdivision sitting beyond my western fence line. It belonged to my family, and every foot of gravel beneath those tires had been paid for with decades of sweat, repairs, droughts, floods, and weekends spent rebuilding washouts after heavy rain. My name is Ethan Walker, and my family has raised cattle on this ranch for 3 generations. My grandfather believed that land remembers the people who care for it, and my father taught me that ownership means protecting something long after everyone else thinks it's no longer worth fighting for. I never planned on becoming the man who spent his evenings studying county plats and easement records instead of watching baseball on television. But life has a funny way of choosing your education for you. 6 months earlier, a developer offered me more money than I'd ever imagined for the western edge of my ranch. They wanted to connect their luxury subdivision to the highway with a faster entrance road. The problem was simple. The only practical route crossed my property. I thanked them for the offer and said no. That single word apparently offended people who believed every signature had a price. A week later, the phone call started. Then came letters filled with polite threats disguised as business opportunities. After that, Victoria Hawthorne, president of the neighboring HOA, introduced herself with the brightest smile I'd ever seen attached to someone who never accepted the word no. She insisted the community deserved easier access. She claimed everyone would benefit. She even suggested refusing to cooperate made me selfish. When charm failed, the fake patrol vehicles appeared. Every morning they drove through my ranch like clockwork, waving at contractors inside the subdivision as if repetition alone could transform private property into public convenience. Most people would have seen 3 SUVs kicking up dust across a country road. I saw something much bigger. Every pass left fresh tire marks, fresh evidence, and one more reason to stop reacting emotionally and start preparing patiently. Because what Victoria still didn't know was that every unauthorized drive down my ranch road was bringing her 1 mile closer to the most expensive mistake her HOA would ever make. The western fence line stretched almost 2 miles from north to south, following a shallow creek that my grandfather used to call the backbone of the ranch. Every cedar post, every strand of barbed wire, every cattle guard had a story attached to it because nothing out here had ever arrived by accident. My grandfather, Harold Walker, bought the first 180 acres after returning from the Korean War with little more than determination and an old pickup that barely survived the drive home. Over the next 40 years, he expanded piece by piece whenever neighboring ranchers decided to retire, eventually building what became 620 acres of grazing land that fed 3 generations of our family. When I was 8 years old, he handed me a worn shovel and pointed toward the ranch road. He smiled beneath a faded straw hat and said, "If you ever own land, remember this. Roads are not just dirt. Roads decide who controls everything connected to them." At the time, I thought he was talking about cattle trailers and hay deliveries. Decades later, I realized he was talking about something much bigger. After graduating high school, I spent nearly 20 years working heavy civil construction across Texas, helping build bridges, county roads, drainage systems, and utility corridors. I learned how surveys worked, how easements were negotiated, and how expensive mistakes became when someone ignored property lines. Those jobs paid well enough that I never had to mortgage the ranch after my father passed away unexpectedly. Instead, I invested every spare dollar into improving the operation. We replaced aging water tanks, upgraded fences, restored grazing fields, and rebuilt several sections of the private ranch road with crushed limestone that could handle fully loaded cattle trailers during rainy seasons. That road became the quiet backbone of everything we did. Feed trucks used it before sunrise. Veterinarians followed it during calving season. Neighbors crossed it only after calling first, because everyone around here respected the difference between being welcome and assuming permission. That simple understanding had existed for decades until Willow Creek Estates appeared beyond the western ridge. Within 18 months, open pasture transformed into rows of oversized houses with identical mailboxes, decorative stone entrances, and perfectly trimmed lawns that looked more like magazine covers than neighborhoods. Construction crews worked from dawn until dusk, and every few weeks another section of pasture disappeared beneath concrete. I never complained because people have the right to develop land they legally own. My concern started when survey stakes appeared suspiciously close to my fence. Soon afterward, expensive sport utility vehicles began slowing down near my entrance, their drivers studying the road as if measuring it with their eyes. Then came letters offering to purchase only the western corridor of my ranch. They described it as a narrow strip with limited agricultural value, but I immediately recognized what they were really asking for. They did not want pasture. They wanted permanent access. Without my road, their newest subdivision forced residents to drive nearly 6 extra miles before reaching the state highway. With my road, property values would increase overnight. I politely declined every offer because selling that corridor would split the ranch into 2 disconnected sections and permanently change the operation my family had built over 60 years. Apparently, saying no was interpreted as the beginning of a negotiation instead of the end of one. That was when unfamiliar faces started appearing more often, slowing near my gate, taking photographs, and acting as though patience alone would eventually wear me down. They had no idea that every mile marker, every fence corner, and every inch of gravel had already taught me the one lesson my grandfather never stopped repeating. Land does not belong to the loudest person. It belongs to the one who knows exactly where the boundary begins. Victoria Hawthorne finally came to my ranch on a bright Friday afternoon, arriving in a white luxury sport utility vehicle that looked more comfortable outside a country club than beside a cattle pasture. She stepped out wearing polished riding boots that had clearly never touched real mud, sunglasses balanced perfectly on her head, and a smile so carefully rehearsed it never reached her eyes. The warm breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut hay across the yard, while a windmill creaked steadily behind the barn. She glanced around like she was inspecting a future investment instead of someone else's home. "Mr. Walker," she said with cheerful confidence, "you are standing in the way of tremendous progress." I leaned against the fence and let her continue because I had already learned that people eager to control a conversation usually reveal more than they intend. She unfolded a glossy site plan across the hood of her vehicle and pointed toward the western ridge. There were sketches of walking trails, decorative ponds, and another phase of Willow Creek Estates filled with expensive homes. A bold red line crossed directly through my ranch road. "This entrance would benefit thousands of future residents," she explained. "You could retire comfortably. Everyone wins." I looked down at the map, then back toward the cattle grazing peacefully less than 200 yards away. "The answer is still no," I replied. Her smile held for another second before fading into something colder. "You may want to reconsider," she said quietly. "Communities have a way of adapting." She folded the plans, climbed into her vehicle, and drove away without another word. The following Monday, adaptation apparently began. The first white patrol vehicle appeared shortly after sunrise. Then another. By the end of the week, they had established what looked like a routine schedule. Every morning between 7 and 9 o'clock, one or more vehicles drove through my ranch road, continued nearly a mile across the property, turned around near the south pasture, and drove back toward the subdivision. They waved at construction crews, nodded at delivery trucks, and behaved as though repeating the trip often enough would somehow create legal authority. A few days later, temporary signs appeared near my western fence. They read community access route in bright reflective lettering mounted on portable metal stands. None of them sat on my property, but they faced directly toward my entrance, encouraging delivery drivers and visitors to believe the road belonged to the subdivision. Before long, I found unfamiliar tire tracks branching into the grass, where people assumed the ranch road was public. Contractors slowed to check directions. Real estate agents occasionally drove halfway through the property before realizing they had taken the wrong road. Every unnecessary vehicle stirred clouds of pale limestone dust that drifted across water troughs and settled onto freshly cut hay. The cattle became noticeably uneasy whenever engines echoed through the valley. Even my border collie, Scout, stopped sleeping near the front porch because unfamiliar traffic interrupted the quiet rhythm he had known since he was a puppy. Then the paperwork started arriving. Official-looking notices printed on heavy paper claimed the road required cooperative maintenance because it served community interests. Another letter invited me to attend an HOA infrastructure meeting even though I had never joined their association. Someone even mailed me a proposed maintenance invoice listing road grading, drainage improvements, and landscaping that had never occurred on my property. Each envelope carried polished language, impressive formatting, and just enough confidence to make someone unfamiliar with property law hesitate. That was exactly what worried me. They were no longer trying to convince me to sell. They were trying to convince everyone else that the road already belonged to them. For nearly 3 weeks, I changed nothing. I did not move the gate. I did not replace the signs. I did not stand in the middle of the road arguing with people who wanted me to react. Instead, I watched. Every morning, I carried a small notebook in the pocket of my work shirt, and every evening I transferred every observation into a spreadsheet on my office computer. Years in construction had taught me one lesson that mattered more than any argument. Documentation outlives opinions. The first entry was simple. 7:23 in the morning. White sport utility vehicle marked HOA Patrol entered through my gate. For occupants, exit 7:36. The second day, another vehicle followed. The third day, a delivery truck turned onto my ranch after following one of the patrol vehicles, forcing me to guide the confused driver back toward the county road. Soon the notebook filled with license plate numbers, photographs, weather conditions, and timestamps. Tiny details most people ignored began forming a pattern too obvious to dismiss. Tire ruts deepened after every rainstorm. Fresh gravel I had spread only a month earlier began disappearing beneath constant traffic. Dust settled across the water tanks closest to the road, leaving a pale film that shimmered under the afternoon sun. Even the mailbox at my entrance started leaning slightly because larger vehicles kept drifting onto the shoulder whenever they passed each other. The ranch itself seemed to notice the change before I fully did. My cattle no longer grazed comfortably near the western pasture during the busiest hours. They slowly migrated toward the eastern fields where the only sounds came from windmills and songbirds instead of engines. Scout stopped greeting me at the front gate each morning and instead waited beside the barn where things still felt normal. The peaceful rhythm my family had built over decades was being interrupted not by one dramatic event, but by hundreds of small ones. Then came the visitors. One afternoon, a retired couple parked beside my equipment shed believing they had reached the model homes advertised by Willow Creek Estates. They apologized repeatedly after realizing they were standing on private ranch property. A landscaping contractor arrived looking for Lot 51. A utility survey crew knocked on my front door asking permission to inspect what they believed was a subdivision access road. Every person had been given directions that treated my ranch road as though it already belonged to the development. I never blamed those people because they had simply followed the information someone else provided. The real problem sat behind a polished desk somewhere, repeating the same story often enough that strangers accepted it without question. The final piece arrived in a plain white envelope without a return address. Inside was a neatly folded map copied from an online satellite image. Someone had highlighted my road with a yellow marker and written Future Community Connector across the top in thick black ink. At first glance, it looked official enough to fool almost anyone. But I immediately noticed the property lines had been removed entirely. No parcel numbers, no easements, no county references. Just my road floating across a blank landscape as if ownership no longer existed. I laid the paper beside my grandfather's original survey stored in a protective folder inside my office safe. The difference between the two documents was impossible to ignore. One represented facts measured by licensed surveyors, and recorded by the county decades earlier. The other represented wishful thinking printed on good paper. That evening, as the last sunlight reflected off the limestone road, and another white patrol vehicle disappeared toward the subdivision, I finally stopped asking myself why they kept driving through my ranch. They were not trying to use the road. They were trying to rewrite its history one trip at a time. The next Monday, I drove into the county seat carrying 2 binders thick enough to make my old construction superintendent proud. One held photographs, timestamps, license plate numbers, drone images, and maintenance receipts. The other contained property records dating back more than 60 years. The courthouse still smelled like old paper, floor polish, and fresh coffee from the small office near the entrance. I started with the sheriff's office because several neighbors had asked why I had not reported the constant traffic sooner. The deputy behind the front desk listened patiently while flipping through my photographs. He nodded more than once, then leaned back in his chair with the expression of someone who had delivered the same explanation many times before. "Mr. Walker," he said, "if they are claiming a legal right to use that road, this becomes a civil property dispute unless another violation occurs. We cannot settle ownership questions from the front desk." I thanked him because he was doing his job, but the answer still left me walking back to my truck feeling like I had spent an hour proving something everyone already knew without changing a single thing. My next stop was the county planning office. A young planner studied the maps for several minutes before confirming that my ranch road appeared on every recorded survey as private access. That should have been encouraging, except she followed it with another sentence that echoed in my head all afternoon. "We cannot stop someone from making claims," she explained. "We can only respond after formal applications or documented violations are reviewed." In other words, facts existed, but they moved slowly. Stories traveled much faster. By the time I returned home, another white patrol vehicle had already crossed the ranch twice. The following week, I met with a property attorney in a brick office overlooking the courthouse square. Shelves filled with leather-bound law books lined the walls, and framed survey maps covered nearly every empty space. He studied my paperwork carefully, occasionally circling notes with a blue fountain pen before removing his glasses. "Legally," he said, "your position appears strong. Practically, however, litigation could last 1 to 3 years depending on filings, appeals, and scheduling." He estimated legal expenses that made even a successful outcome sound exhausting. I drove home beneath a sky turning orange over the hills, listening to gravel crunch beneath my tires and wondering why defending something already proven on paper could become so expensive. Meanwhile, Victoria behaved as though silence meant surrender. New signs appeared inside the subdivision directing visitors toward what she now called the West Community Entrance. Promotional brochures included maps that quietly extended their neighborhood road network onto my property. Real estate advertisements proudly described convenient future access to the highway without explaining that the road belonged to someone who had never agreed to share it. Every small decision created another layer of confusion. Every week, more unfamiliar vehicles wandered onto my ranch, believing they had every right to be there. Friends suggested installing larger signs. Others recommended chaining the entrance shut immediately. A few even told me to confront every driver personally. I ignored all of it because reacting emotionally would only distract from the real issue. My grandfather never solved problems by making the loudest speech in the room. He solved them by understanding exactly where the law stood before taking the first step. So instead of spending another evening worrying about what Victoria might do next, I unlocked the fireproof cabinet in my office, pulled out the original survey packets, engineering drawings, easement files, and decades of county correspondence, then spread every document across the long oak table. Somewhere inside those yellowed pages was a detail everyone else had overlooked, and for the first time since this whole mess began, I stopped searching for someone else to fix the problem and started trusting that the answer had probably been sitting inside my own ranch all along. I worked until nearly 2 o'clock that morning with nothing but an old desk lamp, a pot of black coffee, and stacks of survey maps spread across the oak table my father built 30 years ago. The room smelled faintly of cedar from the bookshelves and aged paper from county records that had been folded and unfolded more times than I could count. Outside, crickets filled the silence while scouts slept beside the office door, occasionally lifting one ear every time another vehicle passed somewhere beyond the western fence. I started comparing every document page by page instead of searching for one dramatic piece of evidence. Construction had taught me that major failures usually begin with overlooked details measured in fractions of an inch rather than miles. Around midnight, I found something that made me stop turning pages. Attached behind the original 1962 survey was a supplemental engineering exhibit prepared when the ranch road had been upgraded in the late 1980s. I remembered helping my father spread fresh limestone that summer, but I had never paid attention to the paperwork. The exhibit included cross-sections, drainage calculations, maintenance responsibilities, and one paragraph highlighted years ago with my father's handwritten pencil mark. It stated that the ranch road remained a privately maintained agricultural access route, and that the owner retained the unrestricted right to install traffic control devices, barriers, or protective infrastructure necessary to preserve livestock operations and roadway integrity, provided they complied with county engineering standards. I read the paragraph 3 more times just to make sure exhaustion was not changing the words. My pulse finally quickened, not because I had discovered a loophole, but because I had rediscovered a right my family had possessed for decades. The county had never required me to leave the road permanently open to unauthorized traffic. The law had simply required that any protective improvements meet engineering standards and remain entirely within my property boundary. The next morning, I drove to a civil engineering firm where I used to work with a project manager named Daniel Brooks. He was the kind of engineer who carried a tape measure everywhere and trusted calculations more than opinions. After reviewing the survey packets and visiting the ranch that afternoon, he stood quietly near the entrance watching another white patrol vehicle roll across the limestone without slowing down. He looked at the tire marks, examined the drainage ditches, and finally turned toward me with a slight grin. "You are looking at this as a legal fight," he said. "It is actually an access control project." Those 5 words completely changed how I viewed the situation. We spent the next hour measuring shoulder widths, utility clearances, and setback distances. Daniel sketched several concepts before circling one simple design. Retractable steel bollards mounted in reinforced concrete foundations, positioned entirely inside my recorded property line, with adequate spacing for my cattle trailers, feed trucks, emergency responders, and every authorized vehicle that belonged there. Nothing aggressive, nothing hidden, nothing that prevented lawful access. Just professionally engineered traffic control exactly as the county standards allowed. Before leaving, Daniel handed me a checklist instead of a promise. Engineering drawings, permit application, utility location request, concrete specifications, inspection schedule. Every box represented another legal step, another quiet piece of preparation. That evening, as another patrol vehicle disappeared toward the subdivision beneath a cloud of pale limestone dust, I realized Victoria had spent weeks trying to convince everyone that my road belonged to her community. She never considered the possibility that I was about to improve my own property exactly the way the law had always allowed. Everything moved quietly after that. I filed the engineering plans with the county, requested underground utility markings, and scheduled inspections exactly the way I had done hundreds of times during my construction career. There was something strangely satisfying about following every rule while the people trying to pressure me kept assuming I would eventually lose my patience. The permit clerk barely looked surprised when I explained the project. "Private access improvements?" she asked. I nodded. She stamped the paperwork, slid the approved documents back across the counter, and wished me a good afternoon. It took less than 15 minutes. Weeks of intimidation had accomplished nothing, yet 15 minutes of proper paperwork moved the entire project forward. By the following Tuesday, a concrete crew arrived just after sunrise. The cool morning air carried the smell of wet cement and diesel fuel as the mixer truck backed carefully toward the entrance. Daniel stood beside the survey stakes checking measurements while I watched every location against the original plat map one last time. The steel bollards themselves were impressive without looking dramatic, each one fabricated from heavy structural steel with internal locking mechanisms designed for commercial access control. They were not hidden traps or improvised barriers. They were engineered safety devices installed exactly where the approved drawings required them to be. Anyone looking at the site could immediately tell they belonged there. Curious neighbors slowed along the county road to watch the work. A few waved. Others simply observed from their vehicles before driving away. Even several construction workers from the subdivision stopped for a moment, probably assuming I was upgrading the ranch entrance. In a way, they were right. Every shovel of concrete represented another layer of certainty, replacing weeks of uncertainty. Victoria drove past twice that afternoon without stopping. Her white sport utility vehicle slowed just enough for her to study the equipment before continuing toward the subdivision. I almost laughed because I could imagine the conversation taking place at the next HOA meeting. They probably believed I was beautifying the entrance or preparing to negotiate after all. The truth never crossed their minds because they had spent so much time trying to predict my emotions that they completely ignored my profession. I had built infrastructure for most of my adult life. Solving access problems was literally what I did for a living. 2 days later, the concrete had cured enough for final installation. Daniel tested each mechanism several times while the county inspector reviewed dimensions, setbacks, drainage flow, and visibility requirements. The inspection lasted nearly an hour. He checked every specification against the approved plans before signing the completion report without requesting a single correction. I slipped the signed paperwork into the same binder that already held photographs, surveys, maintenance logs, and every letter Victoria's organization had mailed me over the previous month. Documentation kept growing while arguments remained unnecessary. That evening, I installed 2 additional security cameras overlooking the entrance from different angles. Both were mounted openly beneath clearly visible signs stating that the property was under continuous video recording. I wanted every authorized visitor to know they were welcome and every unauthorized visitor to understand that nothing occurring at the entrance would ever rely on conflicting memories again. As the sun settled behind the western ridge, the polished steel reflected the last orange light across the limestone road. Scout wandered over, sniffed one of the new posts, then quietly lay beside the gate, as though he sensed something had finally returned to normal. For the first time in weeks, I slept through the night without waking to the sound of unfamiliar engines, because I knew the next move no longer belonged to me. The road had been legally improved, professionally inspected, and fully documented. The only question left was how long it would take before someone who believed rules only applied to other people discovered that steel does not care about assumptions. Monday arrived with the kind of clear Texas morning that makes every sound travel farther than usual. I was already on the front porch before sunrise, a mug of black coffee warming my hands while Scout rested quietly beside the steps. The limestone road looked almost unchanged except for the polished steel posts standing neatly in place near the entrance. They reflected the first rays of sunlight so naturally that anyone paying attention would have immediately realized the access point had been professionally upgraded. Every warning sign was visible. Every boundary marker remained exactly where it had always been. Nothing about the entrance was hidden or misleading. At 7:21, the familiar rumble echoed across the pasture. One white sport utility vehicle approached from the subdivision, followed by 2 more at a comfortable distance. They rolled toward the ranch entrance with the same confidence I had watched for nearly a month. Instead of slowing to examine the new installation, the lead driver hesitated only briefly before stopping several feet from the steel bollards. Through my binoculars, I watched 2 uniformed security employees step out and study the entrance. One pointed toward the warning signs while the other appeared to make a phone call. Less than 10 minutes later, Victoria arrived in her white luxury sport utility vehicle. Even from my porch, I recognized the determined posture she carried whenever she believed she could simply outlast someone else's patience. She climbed out, folded her arms, and spent several minutes speaking with the security team. They looked toward my house several times, but never walked to the porch. Finally, Victoria drove away. I assumed the message had finally become clear. I was wrong. Around 9 o'clock, a county inspector pulled into the entrance after calling ahead for permission. He reviewed the completed installation, compared it with the approved engineering drawings, and signed the final inspection acknowledgement on site. Before leaving, he smiled and said, "Everything matches the permit exactly. Your access control improvements are fully compliant." Hearing those words felt strangely peaceful. They were not dramatic. They were simply official. Less than an hour later, another unexpected visitor arrived. This time, it was an insurance field investigator responding to reports that private access had recently changed. I handed him copies of the permits, inspection reports, engineering drawings, and maintenance records. He spent nearly 40 minutes reviewing everything before photographing the entrance from multiple angles. As he packed his equipment, he quietly remarked, "These records are some of the most organized property documentation I have ever reviewed." That afternoon, the sheriff's office called asking whether they could stop by to clarify several complaints submitted over the weekend. Two deputies arrived, watched selected security footage showing weeks of repeated unauthorized entries, reviewed the property surveys, and compared the video timestamps with my written logs. One deputy slowly closed the binder and looked toward the entrance. "This explains a great deal," he said. "Several reports describe this road as public access. Your documentation says otherwise." By sunset, the atmosphere had completely changed. The familiar white patrol vehicles no longer crossed the ranch. Delivery trucks stopped following the wrong directions. Even online mapping services quietly updated their suggested routes after county records were reviewed. Within days, the temporary subdivision signs pointing toward my entrance disappeared without announcement. Victoria never came back to argue. She did not have to. Facts recorded by engineers, inspectors, surveyors, and county officials had accomplished what weeks of loud assumptions never could. As evenings settled across the pasture, the wind carried only the gentle sound of cattle moving through fresh grass instead of engines rolling over limestone. Every small detail I had documented from the beginning, every photograph, every notebook entry, every faded survey, every permit, and every steel post had quietly connected into one undeniable truth. The road had never changed ownership. Only the story surrounding it had changed, and once the facts finally caught up, the fiction had nowhere left to drive. A month later, the ranch felt like it had taken a deep breath for the first time in weeks. Dawn sounded the way it always had before all of this started. Meadowlarks perched along the fence posts. Wind pushed gently through the live oaks. The only tire tracks on the limestone road belonged to feed deliveries, veterinarians, neighbors who called ahead, and my own pickup returning home after long days in the pasture. The steel bollards had already become part of the landscape, standing quietly at the entrance without demanding attention from anyone willing to respect the property line. They were never the real victory. They were simply the physical reminder that preparation matters more than confrontation. The real victory arrived through paperwork, patience, and facts that refused to change no matter how many times someone repeated a different story. County records were updated to include the completed access improvements. Several promotional materials for the subdivision quietly disappeared from local real estate websites after property descriptions were corrected. The temporary signs directing visitors toward my ranch never returned. Delivery companies adjusted their navigation notes. Contractors stopped appearing at my gate by mistake. Even the utility crews that had once treated my road like a future neighborhood entrance now checked the recorded plats before scheduling any field work. It was almost surprising how quickly confusion disappeared once accurate information finally replaced confident assumptions. I never received an apology from Victoria Hawthorne, and honestly, I stopped expecting one. Some people believe admitting they were wrong costs them authority. I learned long ago that real authority comes from accepting responsibility before someone else has to remind you. The last time I saw her was from a distance at the county feed store. She noticed me loading fencing supplies into my truck, paused for a moment, then quietly walked toward her own vehicle without saying a word. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting across a parking lot, no final speech, just two people heading in different directions after the law had already settled the conversation. Daniel stopped by the ranch one afternoon to check how the entrance was holding up after several weeks of regular use. We stood beside the gate listening to cattle move through the north pasture while sunlight reflected softly across the steel posts. He smiled and said, "Funny thing about good engineering. When it works, people eventually forget it is even there." I looked down the road my grandfather had built more than 60 years earlier and realized he had been right all along. Roads decide who controls everything connected to them, but only if the owner understands both the land beneath the gravel and the laws protecting it. Before putting the old survey packets back into the fireproof cabinet, I noticed the faded pencil mark my father had left beside that forgotten paragraph decades earlier. I traced it gently with my finger, closed the folder, and returned it to the shelf where it belonged. Some people inherit money. Some inherit buildings. I inherited something far more valuable, the habit of keeping records, respecting boundaries, and never confusing patience with weakness. Every dusty notebook, every photograph, every survey map, every permit, every inspection report, and every quiet morning spent refusing to be provoked had led to the same ending. Justice did not arrive with flashing lights or raised voices. It arrived one document at a time until there was nothing left to argue about. As the sun settled behind the western ridge, I closed the ranch gate, listened to the familiar crunch of gravel beneath my boots, and smiled because the road stretching toward my home looked exactly the way it was always meant to look. Private, peaceful, and finally understood. Justice is not loud. It is patient, prepared, and inevitable.